The wagon lurched violently as a young Mustang stallion reared in panic, its wild eyes flashing with terror. The iron axle snapped with a deafening crack, sending the heavy cart sliding sideways toward the sheer drop of the limestone ravine. Eleanor Whitaker was thrown hard against the wooden railing, her breath stolen from her lungs as dust and loose stones cascaded over the edge. Below, the trail plunged hundreds of feet into jagged rocks. The 88 half-starved wild Mustangs tied behind the wagon screamed and pulled in chaos, their hooves thundering against the narrow path. One wrong move and the entire herd, and Eleanor with it, would plunge to their deaths. Gritting her teeth, Eleanor grabbed the brake lever with bleeding hands and threw her full weight backward. "Easy, easy now," she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear surging through her veins. The lead stallion reared again, muscles rippling under his dusty coat. For several terrifying seconds, the wagon hung suspended between life and death, swaying dangerously close to the abyss. With a strength born of pure will, Eleanor coaxed the frantic horses back onto solid ground until the cart groaned and settled against the rocky bank. She collapsed against the wagon wheel, heart-hammering sweat mixing with the dry Texas dust on her face. At 38 years old, Eleanor Whitaker had faced loss before, but never quite like this. It was October 1883 in the Texas Hill Country. 2 brutal years of drought had turned the once verdant land into a cracked, unforgiving wasteland. Small homesteaders were abandoning their dreams, selling out for pennies. Yet Eleanor had returned anyway, drawn by the fading memory of her grandfather Silas and the only piece of earth that still felt like home, Barrow Ridge. By late afternoon, she guided the exhausted wagon and restless herd into the small settlement of Cedar Hollow. The town stirred with whispers as she passed. Wild Mustangs were despised in cattle country. They tore up good grass, spread disease, and symbolized everything ranchers hated: untamed freedom. As Eleanor tied her lead horse outside the feed store, the heavy thud of hooves announced the arrival of the region's most powerful man. Harlan Beckett reined in his massive bay stallion, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow. At 45, he was the undisputed cattle king of the valley, with ice-gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're Silas Whitaker's granddaughter," he said, his deep Texas drawl cutting through the dusty air. "Word reached me you were coming. You're making a grave mistake bringing those wild Mustangs up to Barrow Ridge, Mrs. Whitaker. They'll destroy what little grass is left and bring nothing but trouble." Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It's Miss Whitaker now. And those horses are mine. The ridge is mine. I intend to make something of it." Make. Harlan's eyes narrowed, studying her dusty dress, calloused hands, and the quiet fire in her expression. A low chuckle escaped him, though there was no warmth in it. With what 88 half-dead Mustangs and a dream, that ridge has broken stronger people than you. Sell it to me now before you lose everything. "I'm not here to sell," she replied softly but firmly. "I'm here to stay." Inside the store, Eleanor spent nearly every dollar she had left on supplies and grain for the herd. The shopkeeper shook his head in disbelief, and word of her foolish purchase spread like wildfire through Cedar Hollow. By the time she drove the 88 gaunt, wild-eyed Mustangs up the winding trail to Barrow Ridge, the whole valley was already laughing at the crazy widow and her devil horses. That night, as a cool wind whispered through the cedars, Eleanor stood inside her grandfather's weathered cabin. She lit an oil lamp and opened the old oak desk drawer, finding what she had truly come for: 11 leather-bound journals, filled with Silas Whitaker's meticulous handwriting. While the townsfolk saw worthless wild horses, Eleanor saw something more. She stepped outside into the moonlight. The 88 Mustangs, instead of scattering to graze, had gathered with restless energy along the high western limestone ledge. They pawed at the ground, snorting and nickering, their bodies pressed close to the cracked rock face as if drawn by some invisible force. Eleanor approached cautiously, her boots crunching on dry shale. She knelt among them and pressed her palm against the cold stone. Deep beneath the surface, she felt it, a faint but steady vibration, like the hidden heartbeat of the earth itself. Her grandfather had been right. The land was not dead. But as she rose, the distant sound of a single horse's hooves echoed up the trail from the valley below. Someone was watching. And in this harsh corner of Texas, where water was power and wild horses were enemies, Eleanor knew her real fight was only beginning. The Mustangs shifted restlessly in the darkness, their eyes gleaming with untamed spirit. Whatever secret the ridge held, they had found it first. The morning sun rose over the Texas hills, casting long shadows across Barrow Ridge as Eleanor stepped out of the cabin. The memory of the vibrating stone and the lone rider in the night still lingered, but she pushed forward with quiet determination. Today she would begin the fight to bring life back to this land. She rode down to Cedar Hollow and found Caleb Thorne waiting with his steam-powered drilling rig. The weathered driller eyed the restless herd of 88 Mustangs with clear concern. "Those horses are half wild, Miss Whitaker. They could spook and cause real trouble once the rig starts pounding." "I know," Eleanor replied, "but they're the ones who showed me where to dig. We start at the western ledge." By mid-morning, the rig was set up exactly where the Mustangs had gathered the night before. The moment the heavy iron bit began hammering into the limestone, the herd reacted violently. Several stallions reared and charged their hooves, thundering dangerously close to the crew. One young Mustang nearly knocked Caleb off his feet before Eleanor managed to calm the animal with a firm but gentle voice. Word of her efforts spread rapidly. By noon, a growing crowd of spectators lined the lower trail. The laughter and mockery were loud and cutting. "She's lost her mind," one rancher shouted, "bringing wild Mustangs up here and drilling for water that doesn't exist." Jeb Beckett, Harlan's hot-tempered younger brother, was the loudest. He sat high on his horse, smirking. "Those devil horses will kill someone before winter, and when she fails, that ridge will be up for sale cheap." Eleanor kept working, her jaw set. In the early afternoon, the sound of lighter wheels brought Maeve Donnelly. Her longtime friend climbed down from her buckboard carrying a basket of food and a worried expression. "Ellie, the whole town is talking," Maeve said as they embraced. "They say you're chasing ghosts and that those Mustangs are a danger to everyone. I'm scared for you." Eleanor offered a tired smile. "I'm scared too, Maeve, but I feel it in my bones. The land isn't dead. The horses know something we don't." As the rig pounded deeper into the rock, 20 feet, then 30, the tension in the air thickened. The Mustangs grew increasingly agitated, circling the drilling site and pawing at the ground near the western ledge. Their wild cries echoed across the ridge. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills in fiery orange, the sound of approaching hooves made Eleanor turn. Harlan Beckett rode up alone. He dismounted and approached with long, purposeful strides, his face etched with frustration and something deeper. "You're really going through with this madness," he said, his deep voice tight. "Those Mustangs are tearing up the land and you're risking everything on a fool's dream. I told you last night this ridge has broken better men. Sell it to me before you get yourself killed." Eleanor met his steel-gray eyes without backing down. "And if I find water, Mr. Beckett, what happens to your certainty then?" Harlan stepped closer, his broad frame towering over her. "Water. There hasn't been a decent spring on this ridge in years. You're going to spend every last dollar you have on a hole in the ground, while those wild horses run wild and cause havoc." There was no cruelty in his voice, only raw concern wrapped in the arrogance of a man who had ruled this valley for decades. Yet Eleanor saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes as he watched the Mustangs continue their restless vigil around the rig. "Keep drilling!" "Caleb," Eleanor called out, her voice steady. "We don't stop until the money runs out." The pounding continued as shadows lengthened. At 60 feet, the rig hit harder rock and the engine began to strain. Harlan remained arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He didn't leave. Instead, he stayed as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the crew lit lanterns. By the time they reached 70 feet, Eleanor's tin of silver dollars was nearly empty. The Mustangs grew more frantic, nickering loudly and striking the limestone with their hooves as if trying to break through themselves. Then, at 73 feet, the iron bit suddenly dropped into emptiness. The engine screamed. A deep, powerful groan rose from the earth, not from the machine but from far below. The ground trembled beneath their boots. The 88 Mustangs exploded into chaos, rearing and screaming in unison. A sharp hiss of pressurized air burst from the borehole, blowing a cloud of white dust high into the night sky. The scent of wet stone and ancient water filled the air. Caleb shouted, "Get back!" as the rig shook violently. Eleanor's heart pounded with wild hope. Harlan moved instinctively closer to her, his hand brushing her arm. The Mustangs continued their frenzied cries, as if they alone understood what was about to be unleashed from the heart of the ridge. Whatever lay beneath the stone, it was waking up, and nothing in Cedar Hollow would ever be the same again. The ground shuddered violently beneath their feet as a deep, thunderous groan rose from the depths of the earth. For one breathless moment, everything fell silent except for the frenzied screams of the 88 wild Mustangs. Then, with a mighty roar that shook the limestone ridge, a powerful column of crystal-clear water exploded upward from the borehole. It blasted through the wooden derrick like a geyser shooting high into the night sky before crashing down in a roaring, icy torrent. Eleanor stood frozen in awe as the cold spray soaked her face and dress. The Mustangs reared and wheeled in wild circles, their hooves thundering against the rock as they cried out in what sounded almost like triumph. Caleb Thorne let out a hoarse shout of victory while his crew scrambled to control the surging flow. Water raced down the western ledge, carving new channels through the parched earth and turning the dry dust into dark, glistening mud. By morning, the news had swept through the Texas hill country like a prairie fire. Buckboards and riders streamed up the trail to Barrow Ridge. The same men who had mocked Eleanor now stared in stunned silence at the roaring spring and the wild herd of Mustangs that refused to leave its side. One grizzled cattleman removed his hat and approached her slowly. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitaker. I called you crazy. Turns out you were the only one listening." Yet not everyone celebrated. Jeb Beckett arrived with several ranch hands, his face twisted with anger. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "Those wild Mustangs are still a plague. They'll ruin every pasture they touch." Tension crackled in the air as the crowd watched. Eleanor remained calm, standing near the surging spring with water misting around her. Then she saw him. Harlan Beckett was walking up the steep trail on foot, his big bay stallion left tied far below. His broad shoulders were set with purpose, but his expression carried a weight she had never seen before. When he reached the spring, he stopped a few yards away, taking in the roaring water, the restless Mustangs, and finally Eleanor herself. He stepped closer, pulling a rolled piece of old parchment from his coat. "I didn't come to fight you for this water," he said, his deep voice rough with emotion. "And I didn't come to buy your land." He handed her the map. Their fingers brushed, sending a quiet spark through Eleanor. The parchment showed detailed drawings of underground faults and water flows across the entire valley, signed by a much younger Harlan Beckett. "My father taught me to break the land and rule it with cattle," Harlan said quietly. "When I was young, I believed in hidden springs and stone. He laughed at my maps and told me dreams wouldn't feed a ranch, so I buried them. I became hard. I lost my wife and our firstborn to drought fever years ago. After that, I stopped believing in anything I couldn't control." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the raw pain in his steel-gray eyes. "You're not the only one who's carried heavy losses, Harlan. I buried my husband 3 years ago. Coming back here was my last act of faith." They stood together as the spring continued its powerful surge. Harlan's mother, Lila Beckett, arrived later and watched them with quiet approval. "My son has been lost for a long time," she told Eleanor softly. "You've given him something to believe in again." The moment was shattered when Jeb Beckett rode forward with several men. "You're not giving away our water to a Mustang herder," he shouted. "This ridge should belong to real ranchers." Harlan stepped between them, his voice like thunder. "Enough, Jeb. This water belongs to the land. Eleanor has shown us all what listening looks like. Stand down." Jeb glared at his brother, then at Eleanor before wheeling his horse and riding away in fury. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Harlan and Eleanor alone beside the spring as the sun began to set. Harlan turned to her, his expression raw and unguarded. "You didn't conquer this ridge," he said softly. "You listened to it. You trusted those wild Mustangs when the rest of us saw only trouble." He reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused palm warm and steady against hers. "You've shaken everything I thought I knew, Eleanor, and I'm not sorry for it." Eleanor felt her heart open in a way she hadn't allowed since losing her husband. She held his hand tightly as the water roared beside them, and the Mustangs moved restlessly along the ledge, their wild spirits finally beginning to calm. As twilight settled over the Texas hills, Eleanor knew the discovery of water was only the beginning. Winter was coming, and turning this miracle into a lasting legacy would test them all. But for the first time in years, she did not feel alone. 6 months had passed since the night the earth released its hidden gift. Spring had come to Barrow Ridge, painting the Texas hill country in vibrant shades of green. The once barren limestone plateau now flourished with new grass and wildflowers. The powerful artesian spring continued its steady, generous flow, filling the carefully built troughs and irrigation ditches that carried life-giving water down into the thirsty valley below. Eleanor stood on the porch of the restored cabin, watching the 88 wild Mustangs, now healthy and strong, gallop across the greening pasture. Several foals ran beside their mothers, their coats shining under the warm spring sun. What had once been a symbol of chaos and ridicule had become a proud, thriving herd that represented resilience and freedom. A light carriage climbed the trail carrying Ruth Ellison, the territorial agricultural official from Austin. She stepped down with visible admiration as she surveyed the lush fields, the intricate water system, and the magnificent herd of Mustangs. "Miss Whitaker," she said warmly, shaking Eleanor's hand, "what you've achieved here is extraordinary. The governor has reviewed your grandfather's journals and your work. We are entering Silas Whitaker's writings into the state archives as a model of wise and courageous land stewardship. Your story is already inspiring homesteaders across Texas." Eleanor smiled softly, holding her grandfather's final journal close to her heart. "I didn't do it alone. The land spoke. The Mustangs listened first. I simply followed." As the official departed, another rider approached. Harlan Beckett guided his bay stallion up the familiar trail with calm confidence. Over the winter, he had become a constant welcome presence on the ridge. He had worked alongside Eleanor to channel the overflow water to 6 neighboring homesteads, including parts of his own ranch. The valley was healing, and so were old wounds. He dismounted and walked to her, removing his hat. His steel-gray eyes held a depth of warmth and devotion that made Eleanor's heart swell. Behind him, his mother Lila watched with quiet satisfaction, while Maeve Donnelly tended the new community garden below. Even Jeb had begun to change, offering help with the irrigation ditches after seeing the undeniable benefits to the entire region. "The buyers from San Antonio were impressed," Harlan said with a gentle smile. "They've never seen Mustangs in such fine condition. They want to purchase several yearlings at top price." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound light and free. "Who would have believed that the horses everyone wanted to shoot would become one of our greatest blessings?" Harlan took her hand and led her toward the western limestone ledge where everything had begun. The spring's musical murmur filled the air as clear water flowed steadily down the ridge. The Mustangs ran freely below them, manes flying in the breeze, embodying the wild spirit that had first drawn them to this place. They stopped at the edge overlooking the valley that was now alive with green. Harlan turned to face her, his expression tender and certain. "Eleanor," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion, "you came to this ridge with nothing but courage and a few wild horses. You taught me to listen again to the land, to my heart, and to hope. I don't want to simply share water with you. I want to share a life with you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple but beautiful silver ring. "Will you marry me? Will you build a future on this ridge with me as my wife and partner?" Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes as she looked at the man who had once tried to warn her away from this very land. "Yes, Harlan," she whispered, "with all my heart." He slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms. They stood together as the sun began its slow descent, bathing the hills in golden light. The 88 Mustangs raced across the pasture below their hooves, thundering with joyful freedom. Eleanor leaned her head against Harlan's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. She thought of her late husband, her grandfather Silas, and every hardship that had led her here. The land had never been barren. It had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to listen, strong enough to endure the mockery, and open enough to love again. As twilight settled over the Texas hill country and the first stars appeared above the ridge, Eleanor knew she had finally come home. The spring would continue flowing long after they were gone, carrying water, hope, and the enduring spirit of the wild Mustangs to future generations. In the end, it wasn't just water they had found beneath the ridge. It was life, love, and the courage to believe that even the wildest dreams could bloom in the hardest soil.